Elias Cole hadn't spoken to another living soul in nearly 7 years. Not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to. After a lifetime of loss, silence had become his sanctuary. It was quieter out here in the open plains of Wyoming, where his ranch sat like a forgotten dot on a wide sun-bleached map. Time moved slowly here. The wind carried no gossip, the animals made no judgments, and the sky, vast and endless, kept his secrets. Once, long ago, Elias had been a different man, a rancher of few words, yes, but not a stranger to warmth. He had a wife, Annabeth, who brought music and movement into his life, and dreams of raising a family beneath the same wide sky. Together, they had built the farmhouse with their own hands, painting it yellow so it would shine like sunshine even on gray mornings. She baked bread every Sunday and read novels by the window. He remembered the sound of her laughter more clearly than any word he'd ever spoken. But one winter's night, a fire started in the kitchen. No one knew how. Perhaps it was the old stove, perhaps a spark from a lantern. By the time Elias rushed in from the barn, it was too late. The fire had taken everything: his home, his future, his voice. The townsfolk had tried to help in the days that followed. They brought food, blankets, kind words. The sheriff stopped by, and so did the preacher. But Elias never answered the door. He buried Annabeth himself, in the far corner of the field where wildflowers still dared to bloom, and marked the grave with a wooden cross and a single line carved into it. She was the reason. After that, he drifted from the world. He rebuilt the house alone, piece by piece, keeping it smaller this time. No room for guests, no need for more than one bed, one chair, one plate. He boarded up the windows on the second floor and didn't bother to paint the new walls. Function was all that mattered now. Mornings were spent feeding the cattle, afternoons mending tools, evenings sipping bitter coffee beside the wood stove. When something broke, he fixed it. When something died, he buried it. That was life. His only companion was an old sheepdog named Boone, who had wandered onto the property 2 years after the fire and simply stayed. Boone didn't ask questions or demand attention. He lay at Elias's feet during storms and followed him silently from pasture to pasture. They made a good pair, two creatures who understood that some things were too heavy to speak aloud. People in town speculated they called him the Silent Man of Cedar Ridge. They made up stories about why he never came to church, why he never looked anyone in the eye at the feed store. Some said he'd gone mad. Others said he was just broken. But Elias didn't care. He didn't hate them for their talk. He simply didn't see the point in correcting them. Once a child had wandered onto his property, lost during a church outing. Elias had found the boy crying near the creek and led him home without a word, a hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. The child later told his parents, "The quiet man has kind eyes." That had stayed with Elias more than anything else spoken in years. His world was one of silence and survival, stripped bare of anything unnecessary. He never planned to change. He never wanted to. He'd made peace with his exile. But life, as Elias would soon learn, has a way of stirring even the deepest stillness. And one night, in the middle of a storm, when the wind howled and the barn doors creaked open, his quiet world would be cracked wide open by the sound of footsteps, muffled sobs, and the presence of 12 terrified girls seeking refuge in the very place he'd chosen to disappear. The storm rolled in just after sunset. Elias had been chopping wood all afternoon, and by dusk, the clouds had gathered like bruises across the horizon. The kind of clouds that whispered warning, thick, low, and churning. He could smell the rain. Before it hit, a raw, earthy scent that made Boone's ears twitch. The sheepdog had already retreated under the porch, tail curled around his paws, eyes scanning the sky. Inside the house, Elias lit the oil lamp and settled into his chair with a cup of black coffee. Thunder cracked in the distance, sharp and sudden, followed by the patter of rain drumming against the tin roof. It wasn't unusual weather, not for this time of year, but there was something in the air tense, expectant, like the sky was holding its breath. It was Boone who heard it first. The old dog lifted his head suddenly and let out a low growl, the kind he reserved for things that didn't belong. Elias followed his gaze to the window. Beyond the glass, the night was thick with rain and fog. But then a flicker, movement, not an animal, too coordinated, too human. He grabbed his lantern and his rifle, not because he expected trouble, but because a man who lived alone knew better than to open a barn door empty-handed in the middle of a storm. As he stepped outside, the wind hit him like a wall, cold, sharp, full of flying dust and the scent of lightning. The barn was dark, save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating its silhouette. Elias approached cautiously, boots sinking into the muddy earth. He unlatched the barn door and pushed it open, half expecting to find a coyote sheltering from the storm or a lost deer tangled in the hay. What he found instead stopped him cold. 12 figures, girls, young women, soaked to the bone, were huddled in the far corner, shivering beneath torn blankets and old feed sacks. They froze when he entered, like animals caught in a snare. White eyes, pale faces, a mix of terror and defiance. Elias didn't speak. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm raging outside and the slow drip of water from their clothing onto the dirt floor. Then one of them, the tallest, stepped forward. Her brown hair clung to her face, and her voice shook as she spoke. "We don't mean any harm, sir. We just needed somewhere to stay. Just for the night." Elias scanned the group. None of them could have been older than 18. The youngest looked no more than 10. Their clothing was plain matching skirts, long-sleeved blouses, heavy boots, not modern, not casual, not free. The girl continued, her voice steadier now. "We're from the preacher's camp, about 20 miles west, up near Larkspur Ridge. We ran, actually, we didn't know where else to go." Elias didn't reply. He simply lowered the rifle, stepped back into the rain, and disappeared toward the house. The girls exchanged glances, unsure whether to run or wait. But a few minutes later, he returned with an armful of wool blankets, a jar of honey, a basket of bread, and a chipped metal pot of hot tea. He said nothing as he placed the items near the hay and walked away, Boone following at his heels. Inside the barn, the girls stared at one another in stunned silence. "Did he say anything?" whispered one of the younger girls. "No," Ruth replied softly, "but I think he meant you're safe here," and somehow, that was enough. That night, while the wind howled and the rain battered the old barn roof, Elias sat on his porch, drenched in thought. He hadn't shared his home with anyone in years, not even in passing. But tonight, a dozen strangers had fallen into his world like ghosts in a storm. And somehow, for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. When morning broke, the rain had eased into a light drizzle, and a gray mist clung to the land, like a secret unwilling to let go. Elias rose before dawn, as always, and went about his routine, feeding the horses, checking the fence line, boiling coffee over the stove. He didn't look toward the barn, though it sat in clear view from the kitchen window. He didn't need to. He knew they were still there. Eventually, curiosity or perhaps something deeper nudged him toward the barn once again. As he approached, he found the door slightly ajar. From inside came the faint sounds of whispers, the shuffle of boots, and soft giggles quickly hushed. He knocked lightly before entering, unsure why he bothered with formality. The scene inside had changed. The girls had tidied the barn as best they could. Hay was stacked into cleaner piles, and the dusty floor had been swept in uneven strokes. They'd fashioned makeshift beds from saddle blankets, and a few of them were braiding one another's hair, while the younger ones played with bits of twine. When they saw Elias, they froze, once more eyes wide, hands still, hearts in their throats. The same tall girl from the night before stood up. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was firmer now. "For the tea and the blankets." Elias gave a slow nod. She stepped forward and extended a hand, not to shake, but to introduce. "My name's Ruth. Ruth Brenner. I'm the oldest." "Benna." Turning slightly, she gestured toward the rest. "This is Mary, Esther, Naomi, Lydia, Sarah, Goanna, Rebecca, Marta, Deborah, Rachel, and little Abigail." She glanced back at Elias with a trace of pride. "We're sisters." He looked over them again. 12 girls, dirty, tired, but composed. Their names sounded like they'd stepped out of scripture. Their faces were pale from travel, their eyes full of both fear and resolve. He didn't need to ask where they'd come from. Their clothes, their manner, their silence, it all told the story. They had grown up under strict eyes and tighter rules. "We came from the camp," Ruth explained, more to fill the silence than expecting a conversation. "The preacher's camp. Our father runs it. Or used to." Elias raised an eyebrow, and Ruth sighed. He said the world was full of sin, that girls needed to be kept pure, that obedience was godliness. We weren't allowed to talk to outsiders, weren't allowed to wear colors. We learned scripture, we cooked, we cleaned, we were prepared. Prepared for what? Elias finally asked, his voice gravelly and unused. Ruth paused, surprised to hear the sound. "For marriage," she said quietly. "Two men we didn't choose." The air grew. "Still," she continued, voice tinged with defiance, "now, when the day came, and he told me who I was to marry, I said no. He slapped me. Then he turned to Esther and told her she'd go instead. That night, we packed bags, took what food we could, and walked until our feet bled. We were planning to head north, but the storm caught us. And then, we saw your barn." Elias studied their faces, not just scared, determined, brave, in a way most grown men weren't. He felt a pang, something old and buried stirring in his chest. "You have a place to go?" he asked slowly. Ruth hesitated. "Not really." He nodded again, turned, and walked out of the barn. The girls blinked, uncertain what his silence meant. But moments later, he returned with a large metal pot of warm oats and a jug of goat's milk. He placed them by the door, looked Ruth in the eyes, and simply said, "Eat." Then he left them once more, but this time, with a sense of quiet understanding behind him. That day, the girls rested, and Elias watched from afar. He couldn't explain it, why he didn't turn them in, why he didn't send them on their way. But something about them felt familiar. Not in appearance, but in spirit. He too had once run from something he couldn't name. He, too, had once been a soul looking for a barn in a storm. Elias had never been the kind of man to get involved in anyone else's business. He didn't pry, didn't lecture, didn't offer help unless it was asked of him directly, and even then, rarely. That kind of man doesn't just wake up one morning and decide to become a guardian for 12 runaway girls. But that's the thing about life, it has a way of cracking open even the thickest shells when the right moment strikes. All day long, Elias went about his chores, trying to ignore the presence of the girls in the barn. He mucked the stables, repaired a broken fence post by the south field, hauled buckets of feed to the troughs, but his mind kept drifting. He remembered their faces wet with rain, eyes hollow with exhaustion, yet burning with something deeper, defiance and hope. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped entirely, but the wind had picked up. Dry gusts blew across the pasture, rattling the bare trees and carrying with it the smell of wet wood and wild grass. He stood on the porch, arms folded, watching the barn from a distance. Boone sat beside him, silent as always, but with that alert posture that Elias had come to rely on, like the dog could sense what Elias hadn't yet admitted to himself. Inside, the girls were quiet. He could tell they were trying to be respectful. There was no laughter, no loud chatter. Occasionally, he could hear Ruth's voice giving soft instructions or the younger girls humming while they worked. They'd cleaned out a corner of the barn, swept the floors again, even started organizing some of the old tools Elias had abandoned years ago. They weren't hiding anymore, they were making themselves useful. That was what got to him. He knew what it was to be turned away, to be seen as a burden. After the fire, after he lost Annabeth, the world hadn't come running to his rescue. Oh, they'd brought soup and blankets for a week or two, said their sorries, nodded their heads at church. But after that, they'd left him to rot in silence. These girls, whatever they were running from, deserved better than what he'd gotten. But still, what was he supposed to do? He was just one man, a rancher with no experience raising children, let alone 12 teenage girls. He could barely cook for himself. His house wasn't meant for company. His soul wasn't either. That evening, he ate alone again, half a bowl of stew, some stale bread. He sat with Boone by the fire, staring at the flames until his eyes ached. But the quiet that once soothed him now felt too still, too empty. At some point, he stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked back to the barn. The girls were asleep, curled up beneath wool blankets in a patchwork of warmth and sisterhood. Some clung to each other, others stirred lightly as he entered. Ruth, still half awake, rose and met his gaze in the darkness. "We'll be gone in the morning," she whispered. "You've been kind already, more than we expected." He shook his head slowly. "You don't have to go, not yet." Her eyes widened. "But we don't want to cause trouble." "You're not," Elias said, the words feeling strange on his tongue after so many years of silence. "Stay as long as you need." A tear slipped down Ruth's cheek, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you." He nodded again, then turned and disappeared into the night. He didn't need applause. He didn't need their gratitude. He only knew that the sight of them sleeping, finally safe, finally still, had stirred something inside him that he thought had died with Annabeth. And so, Elias Cole made a decision that night, not just to offer shelter, but to do something he hadn't done in years. Open the doors to his life. Not fully, not yet, but a door once opened rarely stays closed for long. The following days unfolded in quiet but undeniable transformation. Elias Cole, once a man whose life followed a strict rhythm of isolation, found his routines being rewritten slowly, subtly, by the unexpected presence of 12 runaway girls. They didn't mean to change him, and he didn't intend to be changed. But change, as it often does, came quietly. It started with breakfast. The girls had always eaten in the barn, those first few days, whatever Elias brought them. They accepted, gratefully and without question. But on the 5th morning, when he arrived with a pot of hot oats and slices of boiled potatoes, he found them already awake, sweeping out the barn floor and organizing tools by size and shape. Ruth looked up from her task and said simply, "We can help you, if you'd like." He didn't answer right away. Elias wasn't used to help. He wasn't used to offers of any kind. But that morning, after a long pause, he handed Ruth the pot and said, "Set it on the table in the tack room. It's warmer in there." The barn became their new kitchen after that. Mary and Sarah took to preparing simple meals. Esther began helping Elias with the animals. Abigail, the youngest, spent her afternoons chasing Boone across the yard, her laughter a sound so foreign to Elias's ears that it made him stop whatever he was doing, just to listen. The girls weren't a burden. If anything, they filled the spaces he had long ignored. The pantry that had been mostly empty now needed restocking. The stove that had rarely been lit now glowed daily. There were wet towels hanging on the back porch, muddy boots by the door, the faint smell of lavender and hay lingering in the hallway. They didn't ask for rooms in the house at first. The barn was theirs. It had become their sanctuary, and Elias respected that. But he did bring over extra blankets, fresh soap, and a long-forgotten sewing kit Annabeth had once used. He found himself fixing broken hinges, tightening loose boards, even running a wire out for a small lamp so the girls could read or write at night. One afternoon, Ruth approached him again. "We're not looking to stay forever," she said. "But if we stay a little while, we'd like to earn our keep." Elias, leaning on a shovel, looked at her with a raised brow. "You already are." Still, they insisted, so he began giving them small tasks. Joanna helped clean out the chicken coop. Naomi began keeping track of the feed inventory. Martha took to tending the vegetable patch behind the house, where Annabeth's garden had once bloomed. The land, neglected for so long, began to respond almost gratefully to the extra hands. But not all change was external. Elias began to speak more. Not much, just a word here, a sentence there. At first it startled the girls, but soon they came to see. His voice has something precious, something earned. He had opinions. He had wit. Sometimes, he even had stories about cattle drives gone wrong, prairie fires he'd survived, and once, a horse that only understood commands in French, and the girls. They laughed, loudly. Without shame, laughter returned to the ranch like spring. After a long winter, at first it felt strange, then comforting, then necessary. Elias wasn't ready to admit how deeply they'd worked their way into his life. He still kept certain rooms closed, still ate most dinners alone, still walked to the field each evening to stand by Annabeth's grave. But even that ritual had changed. He now brought Bunand, sometimes Abigail, who held his hand without asking, and he found that the silence by the grave no longer felt so heavy. For years, Elias Cole had lived like a ghost on his own land. But now, it was as if the ranch had woken up, stretching after a long sleep. There were voices in the air again, footsteps on the porch, songs drifting from the barn, a pair of old boots by the door that didn't belong to him. He hadn't planned for this, but sometimes the best parts of life come unplanned. Just as the rhythm of the ranch began to settle into something almost resembling harmony, a dark reminder of the past came knocking, literally. It was a Thursday morning when the knock came, sharp and hard against the front door of Eli's cabin. He wasn't expecting anyone. He rarely did. Most folks in town had long learned to leave Elias Cole alone. Boone barked once, then sat stiffly by the window, ears forward. Elias opened the door cautiously, rifle nearby, though not in hand. On the porch stood a man in a tan sheriff's coat, tall, middle-aged, with eyes that scanned everything like he was writing it down in his head. His badge caught the morning light. "Elias Cole?" the sheriff asked. Elias gave a small nod. "I'm Sheriff Maddox, out of Larkspur County. Got a few questions?" Elias stepped outside and closed the door behind him, blocking the view of the barn, where the girls were starting their morning chores. He didn't need to be told what this was about. Sheriff Maddox glanced toward the distant barn and then back at Elias. "You've had any visitors lately? Strangers passing through?" "No," Elias said, his voice low, unreadable. The sheriff studied him a moment longer. "Reason I asked, there's been reports. A group of young girls went missing from a religious camp about 20 miles from here. Preacher Jacob Brenner filed a complaint last week. Said his daughters vanished in the night. Town's been keeping an eye out." Elias said nothing. "You sure you haven't seen anything strange?" Maddox pressed. Elias met the sheriff's eyes without blinking. "If I had, I'd let you know." The sheriff nodded slowly, like he didn't quite believe it but didn't have reason to push further. "All right then. If you do see anything, or if anyone turns up needing help, you send word, all right?" "Will do." Maddox left, his truck spitting gravel as it rolled down the long dirt road. Elias stood on the porch long after he was gone, jaw tight, hands balled into fists. Boone whined beside him. Later that day, he told Ruth what had happened. She was quiet at first, staring at the ground, her hands clenched around the hem of her skirt. "He won't stop," she finally said. "Our father, he won't rest until he gets us back." Elias looked at her. She wasn't a child. None of them were. They had grown up fast, under rules so harsh they bordered on cruelty. And yet, they hadn't broken. They'd run, survived, built something new here. "He won't find you," Elias said. "Not here, not unless someone talks." "But what if someone does?" Ruth asked, her voice small. "What if someone sees us? What if they won't?" Elias said, his tone firm. "We'll be careful. You'll stay on the ranch. I'll handle any visitors." He didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. This land protects its own. Still, the tension returned like smoke after a fire. The girls were more cautious, staying out of view whenever they heard a vehicle approach. Boone was on alert constantly, and Elias kept his rifle closer than usual. Every knock at the door sent a ripple of fear through the barn. But in that fear, something else began to form: trust. The girls trusted Elias not just because he fed them or gave them shelter, but because when danger crept near, he stood between them and the world without hesitation. And Elias trusted them too. They didn't run. They didn't bring trouble. They didn't ask for more than he could give. They just needed to be safe. And for the first time in years, Elias realized that he needed to protect something again. The man who once swore he'd never care about anyone. Again, who had buried His wife and his heart, along with her, was learning that care could be quiet. It could be a bowl of soup, a fixed fence, a watchful eye at dusk. It didn't have to be grand. It just had to be real. And in that quiet care, the ranch once a place of mourning became something new, a sanctuary. As weeks turned into months, the seasons shifted. Summer gave way to crisp autumn winds, painting the ranch in amber and gold. The grass thinned, the mornings grew sharp with frost, and the girls began wearing heavier coats, some stitched by Lydia, who had a knack for sewing patterns into fabric like prayers. With each passing day, the land changed, but even more so, the people on it did. What had begun as a temporary refuge was now a home in everything but name. By October, Elias had carved out a new rhythm, one that revolved not only around cattle and fences, but around the laughter in the barn, the baking smells drifting from the outdoor fire pit, and the sight of 12 young women learning how to live life on their own terms. The ranch, once ruled by silence, had become a chorus of voices, sometimes arguing, sometimes singing, always alive. Elias wasn't a father to them. Not really. That word still didn't sit right with him, but there was no denying that he'd become a kind of anchor, someone they could look to when the world felt uncertain. They fixed broken machinery together, taught each other skills, built things with their hands, and healed things in their hearts. One morning, Rebecca came to Elias with a question. "Can we plant something?" He raised an eyebrow. "It's almost winter," she smiled. "I don't mean right now. I mean next spring. A real garden. We could build planter boxes, use the field behind the barn, grow herbs, vegetables, flowers, even sunflowers. Maybe." Elias looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Start drawing it out. Come spring, we'll dig." It was the first time in years anyone had spoken about the future on that ranch as if it mattered, and that seemed to open a floodgate. Suddenly, the girls had projects. Ruth started organizing schedules. Who cooked? Who cleaned? Who helped with what? Joanna convinced Elias to let her repaint the back shed. Naomi kept books on supplies and costs. Little Abigail declared she was going to teach Boone new tricks. The dog mostly ignored her, but wagged his tail anyway, and Elias started sitting at the same table as them for supper. The first time he did it, the girls went quiet, not out of fear but out of respect. It was an unspoken acknowledgement. Something had shifted. He didn't say much. He rarely did, but he listened. He smiled when Rachel made a joke. He nodded when Martha explained why she thought potatoes should be stored in burlap, not plastic. And once, when Deborah burned the bread, he shrugged and said, "Tastes fine," to me, which sent the whole table into laughter. They had become a strange little family, not by blood, not by law, but by choice. But beneath the surface of their new life, shadows lingered. Every so often, the past crept back in. A nightmare, a name, a sudden sound that made one of them flinch. The memory of the preacher hadn't vanished. He was still out there, somewhere. And with each day that passed, Elias worried more about what he might do if he ever found them. Still, they did not live in fear. They planted bulbs along the fence line. They started carving their initials into the old tree by the well. They taught each other how to trust. And Elias, the man who had buried his voice along with his grief, started to laugh again quietly, but often enough that Boone's ears would perk up, surprised. One night in late November, as the first snow began to fall, Elias stood on the porch and watched the girls dancing under the flakes. They were barefoot and ridiculous, spinning like children, shrieking with joy. Ruth caught his eye and beckoned him forward. He hesitated, then took one step down. Then another. And for the first time in years, Elias Cole joined the living. Winter settled over the ranch like a heavy quilt, muffling the sounds of the outside world. Snow blanketed the fields, turning fences into faint lines and the barn into a warm glow in the distance. The girls adapted quickly, hauling water in buckets when the pipes froze, laying down straw in the stalls to keep the animals warm, cooking thick stews that simmered all day. Elias had expected winter to be harder on them. He had even braced himself for the day they might decide to leave, perhaps to seek shelter somewhere warmer, or to reunite with distant relatives. But that day never came. Instead, something else happened. One evening, after supper, Ruth approached him by the fire. The others were busy mending clothes, playing cards, reading from tattered paperbacks. Ruth stood there for a moment, as if weighing whether to speak. "We've been talking," she finally said, "and we think we'd like to stay. For good, if you'll have us." Elias looked up, his weathered face unreadable. "Stay here? You mean through the spring?" "I mean, as long as you want us," she said softly. "We know we're not really your family, and we know we've brought trouble to your door. But this is the first place we've been where we could just be. Where we could work hard, laugh, and not feel afraid every time the sun went down." The room had gone quiet. The younger girls looked up from their games, waiting for his answer. Elias set down his coffee, leaning forward in his chair. He thought about the months behind them, the sheriff's visit, the endless chores, the laughter echoing off the barn walls. He thought about Annabeth and how she'd once dreamed of filling this house with life. "You're not trouble," he said at last, "and you are family. Maybe not in the way the world counts it, but in the way that matters. He didn't say it with ceremony or flourish. He didn't need to. The girls understood. From that moment, they stopped talking about leaving. The barn became their permanent home for the winter, and Elias began drawing plans to fix up the old bunkhouse come spring. He imagined planting the garden Rebecca had asked for, maybe even building a bigger table for the house, so they could all eat together without crowding. But more than the physical changes, something deeper had taken root. Elias no longer woke each morning expecting the day to be empty. There was always something to do, someone to talk to, a reason to keep going. The girls, in turn, began to see themselves not as runaways but as builders of a new life. The ranch wasn't just a place to hide anymore. It was a place to grow. Of course, the threat of the preacher still lingered like a shadow beyond the fence line. Elias knew that one day, someone might come looking again. But if that day came, he wouldn't be standing alone. The land was theirs, now his and theirs, and it would be defended as such. The silence that had once defined the ranch was gone. In its place was the sound of life, the creak of boots on snow, the thump of boots on the porch, the crackle of the fire, the steady hum of voices sharing the day's work. One night, long after the girls had gone to bed, Elias stood at the edge of the porch with Boone beside him. He looked out at the moonlit snow, the barn glowing faintly in the dark, and for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. Annabeth would have liked this, he thought. She would have liked them. The wind rustled through the bare trees, and he smiled faintly, as if hearing her agree. Life on the ranch would never be the same, and that was exactly how it should be.